center email list and wants to know about our events, including, we have fun events like potlucks and parties and gatherings, and there was a student organization I'll tell you about in just a minute. But if anybody would like to get onto our regular center email list, go to our webpage, our homepage, and scroll down to the bottom right, and just click, and then fill in your email, and it's that easy. Just get on our list like that. You can also unsubscribe very easily. So please do that. And then also, if anybody here is interested in joining the Southeast Asia Research Group, SERG, that's our graduate student group and they have a lot of fun. They do picnics and they do all kinds of things. And they have meetings where people share their research, graduate students share their research with each other. And I don't know, it just seems like a really fun group. So that's SERG. You can email me, Mary McCoy, mccoy2@wis.edu if you want to find out more about me. If you want me to connect you to the fabulous SERG people. And one of them, by the way, is Adrian Beyer, who is our grad student assistant who helps run the Friday Forum, who's not here today, but he's more than willing to help people get connected to SERG. I have a couple more things. One is that, two things, okay. So people have been leaving behind objects in this room, and I just leave them whenever I find something lost, I just leave it wherever the person lost it. But if you've left something behind here, I can't guarantee where it went after that, but there is a lost and found downstairs, which is most likely where it went. And there are signs all over the place saying, lost something? Go to this room. So, we keep getting a lot of possessions left behind, especially water bottles. So there's that. And then I'm holding this up because I just want everybody who hates styrofoam to know that I really hate styrofoam. These are left over from like 1932, so we're just trying to use them up. And once we use them up, we will not be buying styrofoam ever again. So that's my note on that. Okay, I have one announcement, but does anybody else have any announcements? Anything coming up, anything exciting? Okay, great. So my announcement is next week, and this is also great for all the students interested in the Philippines who are here today. Next week's talk is by Adrian De Leon. I'm going to pass this flyer around, but it is called Diaspora's Boondocks, Hinterlands in Filipino-American History. And Dr. De Leon is an assistant professor of history from NYU, New York University. That will be right here, same time, same place, different donuts, better donuts even maybe, but next week. So I'm going to pass this around, and I hope you guys can all come to this talk as well. And now I will turn the room over to Professor Al McCoy, who will introduce our speaker today, and looking forward to a terrific talk.
Thanks, Mary. Hi, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Brooke, who is an associate professor in this university's political science department, who is also currently the director of the UW-Madison Middle East Studies program and an associate in the Middle East Initiative at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Apart from these administrative responsibilities, he teaches an introductory course on world politics, advanced courses on non-democracies, Islam and politics, and Middle East politics, as well as a graduate seminar on religion and politics. To reach out beyond the classroom, Professor Brooke has recently recorded 2 podcast lectures in political science's Bascom 1050 series, which you can find at the department's website, on protests in Iran and the Arab Spring. After completion of his doctorate in political science at the University of Texas, Austin in 2015, he quickly published his prize-winning first book with Cornell University Press, Winning Hearts and Votes, exploring how Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood won elections through an elaborate social services network. And for about 15 years, by my reading of his vita, from 2006 to 2022, Professor Brooke, logically enough, focused on that regional specialization by publishing a dozen articles in leading journals, notably an essay on sectarianism and social conformity in Egypt in the Political Research Quarterly, another on social institutional origins of political Islam in the American Political Science Review, and I suppose I should genuflect when I say that, if this were political science, that's the gold standard, I think, in political science, the big one. And he co-authored an article asking who supported early Muslim Brotherhood in the journal Religion and Politics. Now, as admirable, interesting, and maybe even impressive as all that might be, what do we get? I mean, none of it would bring him before a Center for Southeast Asian Studies like our own. But several years ago, they did something which most people don't dare do as academics, which is so anyway, his work on politics and religion, originally focused on Egypt, took a global comparative turn towards the Philippines. And just last year, he co-published a major study in the American Journal of Political Science on religious protection from populist violence, using a very creative mix of methodologies, including a database of 2,000 drug war killings and interviews with Philippine parish priests and laity, to show that in Metro Manila neighborhoods with a combination, and it's more complex than this, but basically a combination of an active Catholic parish and local actors who were personally committed to human rights, that these neighborhoods experience a reduction in the number of killings by as much as 30%, which is quite significant in the midst of a drug war under former President Duterte that's believed to have killed about 30,000 people. That study proved so promising that he currently has a book contract with Cambridge University Press for a monograph titled Religious Protection from Populist Violence. And today he's going to give us a sampling of this ambitious project with a talk titled Community Protection from Populist Violence, the Catholic Church and the Philippine Drug War. Thank you. Sam.
All right. Thank you so much, Al, for that very generous introduction, and also Mary for the introduction as well, and also Nam and the whole community here for inviting me. I mean, this is a really great opportunity for me, just to give you like a really quick way to think about this project. It's currently under contract. It's a book manuscript. It's under contract. It is slated contractually for delivery in March. So please feel free to point out things that you think we should change, especially if they're like very small and easy to change things, okay? So as Al said, I kind of came to this late, and it's not quite this kind of story that would be as exciting as like how the Beatles formed or anything like that. It's just more that my colleague Dave, who is a professor at the University of Louisville, where I was before I came to the University of Wisconsin, he's more of a specialist on the Philippines. We both study religion and politics, but we kind of got to talking just about the drug war. It was kind of hard to miss, even as somebody who doesn't really study the region. And we started talking about it. We started talking about human rights. We started talking about the capacity of certain actors to kind of intervene between kind of the state and the local population. And my interest was from the Islamic world, and even more specifically, like I kind of describe my interest in religion and politics as an interest in like what houses of worship do when they're not serving as houses of worship, right? And so I was interested in thinking institutionally of like the physical structure of neighborhoods and the kind of social role of a house of worship and a religious elite. He is interested in kind of the classic Catholic politics, religion in politics, or like politics in the Philippines. And we kind of got together and realized like we actually might have a project here, right? Like we could study this, right? If we have an intuition about what's going on the ground, we can then kind of figure out like where can we kind of triangulate data, and where can we kind of go to maybe see if some of these hunches actually are borne out in some of the data that we collect. And so we started working on this project, and we were very quickly kind of, as we were thinking about data, we got in touch with some of the, I think, really stellar team at Filipino universities, including Ateneo de Manila, which some of you guys may be familiar with. And two people there in particular, Ron Mendoza and Clarissa David, were really kind of helpful for us with thinking through some of the data questions. It turns out they had actually been collecting a lot of the data that we were interested in, and we decided to collaborate with them on the article. And so it's kind of the four of us kind of all, jumping together and kind of thinking through some of these projects. After we published the article, they were kind of content to step back, and Dave and I kind of, because we're academics and just kind of tunnel focused on some of these things to the point of maybe insanity. We just thought there's more to this story that we can tell, and so we just kept kind of pushing forward, and now we have a book, or almost a book. So I'm going to just kind of give you a little brief overview of this project, right? It's a sprawling project. It's going to have to go through some major cuts before it actually hits the page, but I want to just give you a sense of the general idea and the argument. So today I'm going to give you just like a brief idea of like what about Rodrigo Duterte and the drug war is kind of interesting to us, like interesting from a political science perspective, I mean. I want to give you just like a brief look at kind of Catholic Church localized community protection, how we kind of tried to research this, and this is where I'm going to introduce some data that we have and talk through like how we use different types of data to answer different questions that kind of flowed from this overall schema. I want to go more into how and why these mechanisms of community protection worked, right? As we kind of did our research, as we kind of got to know the case a little bit better, we kind of isolated, we say kind of 6 things that we think allowed the Catholic Church to kind of intervene between kind of state and population. And like, you guys are, I'm sure, aware of the drug war. You're aware of kind of the brutality of it. You're aware of like how sophisticated the state was in actually going after ordinary citizens who, in many cases, had absolutely no way to protect themselves. So one of the things I'll come back to at the end is, like, our story here is not that the Catholic Church was universally effective at protecting people at every time and every place. We're much more tempered than that. We kind of say, at certain times, in certain places, the church was able to do enough to save some amount of lives, right? So it's not a story that's completely deterministic, where there's a church, there was no violence. It's not that type of story. My advisor always told me, like, we don't write mystery novels. Like, tell people the conclusion right up front. So this is the conclusion. Okay, if you walk out of here and you're thinking of like one thing I should tell my students or communicate to my friends or complain about, like, it is this, right? This is the hummable tune, right, when you walk out of the room. So I don't want to kind of belabor the specific mechanics of the drug war, but just to give you a scope, and Al kind of mentioned this as well, just like the human toll of this is shocking, right? Like the death toll, and I mean this is a very imprecise estimate, right? It is probably considerably higher than this. It is also something that has attracted the attention of the International Criminal Court, even very early on. But in 2021, the kind of pre-trial chamber kind of as basically like a question of, is there enough to go forward with this investigation? They basically said, you know, there is enough evidence to warrant like a full investigation and potentially a trial, that there were serious crimes, including crimes against humanity in this. And you know, it's tough to kind of think about like this type of violence in scale. Like two of the statistics that I have heard that have really kind of driven it home to me. So just in the first 6 months, there's a statistic that the death toll in this was almost twice it was during the entire martial law period under Marcos. Okay, that's one metric, right? So 6 months versus multiple years. The other kind of statistic is that the death toll here, the death rate, right, is basically about half of what it was for Ukrainian civilians in the first year of the Russian invasion, right? So the scope and the scale of the carnage here is intense. And it's one of these things that when we think about it as like scholars of political violence, it really kind of like scrambles our mind, because if you ask a scholar of political violence, like, what are the things that you focus on, right? People will talk about things like, I may study like genocide, right? I may study like interstate war, right? I might study insurgencies and civil conflicts. Like those are like your big things. This is not that, right? Yet the death toll is in some senses comparable. This is some new type of violence. And so one of the things that we try and do in this project is come up with a way to describe and maybe even help people in other contexts think through this form of violence. So we call it, this is a working title, so definitely any suggestions would be helpful, right? Like we call what happened in the drug war kind of routinized populist violence, right? And it kind of captures a couple things, right? Duterte is a populist, we know that term. Routinized kind of captures a particular way that it rolls out. And one of the things we kind of have four ways to categorize it. So one, we think that there's this rhetorical campaign of exclusion, and crucially here, it targets people on their behavior, right? Like this is a little bit different than what we think of as normal populists. Like if you have an idea of a populist leader in your head, and they're targeting a group of people, you're probably thinking of a populist that is going after people based on some like structural characteristics, right? It's like these people who are part of this ethnicity, right? Like, or they're immigrants, for example. Like we have to kind of, beware of them because of some structural characteristic that they have. This is not that. It's based on behavior, right? They're dehumanized because they use drugs. So in this sense, it's almost like a moral panic in a way, right? Like that's an element of this violence. Now, one thing kind of flows from this, which is that in contrast to other situations of like insurgency or interstate conflict, people here are targeted not by like special units, not by military forces. They're just targeted by ordinary policing, right? It's like an ordinary thing where police go out and do their duties. It's part of normal governance, right? It's nothing special. It's routinized, okay? So we can kind of just see some illustrative quotes that really kind of back this up. We also think that there's an angle here, and we know this is true from scholars of political violence, that if you think about how violence actually rolls out, and I'm building here on the work of our former colleague here at UW-Madison, Scott Strauss, he kind of talks about like violence as a bureaucratic process, right? We have at the top Duterte, right, in this example, and then below him we have all sorts of layers of bureaucracy all the way down to the ordinary person on the street that has to be the one to carry it out. And at every level there, people have different incentives, right? This is a principal agent problem if you're into that way of thinking about it, which is, Duterte might tell somebody to commit a crime, to go shoot a drug dealer or something like that. But then that agent is also going to be worried, like, well, maybe if I shoot this person, I might lose my job, right? I might go to jail. I might be subject to some penalty. So I'm actually not really going to do it, or I might resist that order from the top. So one of the things that we see here is that the state elite has got to provide some signal that those local agents are protected as long as they do what the state elite is asking them, right? Accountability, we can kind of work around that. And then finally, at the local level, those individuals who are carrying out that violence, we think an interesting kind of thing about them is they do have some degree of discretion, right? This isn't like an ultra-hierarchical, tight military unit where your commanding officer orders you to do something and you basically have to do it. In this case, you get these kind of big picture signals about the drug war, reducing the drug problem, so on and so forth. But when it actually gets down to you on the street, you have a little bit of wiggle room, right? Like maybe if you really believe this, you can be extremely violent without fear of consequence. But maybe if you don't believe this, you might find a way to kind of work around this. So So this is kind of the new form of political violence here. Like, we're trying to be good marketers and create a phrase that everybody's going to cite us when they use. But we do think it's a little bit different than the standard cases of political violence that we as scholars look at. So we've got that big picture stuff. One of the things that's interesting is that if you look at places in the country, and here more specifically in Metro Manila, if you look at places where killings happen, you do see kind of distinct, I don't want to say patterns, but there's clustering, right? There's some neighborhoods that don't seem to have killings or have a few killings, and then there's other neighborhoods that seem to have more killings, right? This is data that we worked in collaboration with Ateneo de Manila in the Philippines to kind of collect and clean and assign to a location. And so basically this is done by trolling through like media reports, like newspaper dispatches on killings or reports on killings, and it will, say things like so-and-so was killed on this day and their body was found in this neighborhood, right? And so we can kind of assign them to that neighborhood for the whole of Manila. And this is kind of the starting point of our investigation, right? What explains these patterns, right? Why are some places much more heavily affected seemingly than others? The thing that we try and match this up against is the location of Catholic churches, right? So we can find this by just looking at church directories, looking at Google, and basically doing the same process of assigning them to whatever neighborhood they exist in. And I won't kind of bore you with all of the statistical data, but the kind of takeaway that we come out from in the article is to basically say there's a pretty consistent relationship that the expected number of killings, given all like this demographic covariates and all of that stuff, in areas where there's no church, in a neighborhood with no church, is just under 2, right? This is what our statistical model is telling us. In those places that have a church, the predicted number of killings is like about 1.3, right? And that's, in statistical language, we would say like, that's kind of strong enough that we can rule out this difference is the result of random chance, or just like noise in the data. There's something driving this. We don't know exactly what it is. We know that it seems to map onto these variables. But that's kind of the prompt for us to ask why, right? Why do we see that relationship in the data? So one of the things that we try and do in the article is come up with a theory of community protection, like why some types of organizations or some types of entities are able to kind of put themselves in between the state and the citizens to protect them. And I'll just kind of back out and do kind of a big picture here. We think that this is not necessarily a story of religion. In this case, it is. But the way that we kind of view this working is that there could be kind of secular analogs to what we think the Catholic Church is doing. In another context, this may be like labor unions. You could imagine a labor union doing this. You can imagine like a student movement being able to do this. So just kind of in terms of keeping our focus on the specific case of the Catholic Church in the Philippines and the theory, like our ambition, I suppose, this is not necessarily a exclusively religious story. So we kind of come up with 2 factors that we think help us kind of explain why the Catholic Church was able to intervene. The first one here is capacity, right? We kind of shorthand this as basically saying like the ability of that local institution or entity or whatever that allows them to intervene in local public affairs. If you want maybe kind of a quicker way to think about it, I would suggest this. Like, how easy is it for that local actor to interface with a government agent, a local government agent, right? Do they have their phone number? is the government agent going to take their call or ignore them, right? Are they going to return their call immediately, or are they going to wait a couple weeks or whatever? Just kind of, it's almost like how plugged in locally that entity is to the local government. Okay? Now, we kind of want to ask ourselves, right? We know that the Catholic Church has this, or we theorize that the Catholic Church has this. And maybe a next question is simply, okay, well, like, where does this come from? How do you get this capacity? And the story that we tell is a little bit unique to the kind of the Philippines case. We argue that parishes that are like embedded in their communities for a long amount of time, they tend to have this, right? You can imagine a church, like the best example of this is like the Baclaran Church, right? This famous shrine in Manila. It's been there for a long time. It's kind of always served as this mode of organization, right? It's always has these ties with like social political movements, right? It's embedded. The other thing that we notice matters is we think certain religious orders, right? So if you think about in Catholicism, like a Franciscan or an Augustinian or a Dominican or a Jesuit or something like that, these are orders, right? They kind of train priests, run parishes, do charity work. We think that certain religious orders, just by virtue of how they imagine their connection to the local environment, right? They seem to be able to produce this type of local capacity, right? And one way we can measure this is we look at the amount of parish ministries that are devoted to things other than worship. So if you're familiar with the Catholic Church, you know that there might be like worship-focused ministries. So as maybe a Catholic layperson, you can contribute to like you can be a Eucharistic minister, right? You can hand out the Eucharist, or you might participate in a choir or sing hymns or something like that. That would be a worship ministry. There are other ministries that are more publicly engaged, right? It's like maybe an environmental ministry. Maybe in the Philippines, a big one is ministries that relate to voting, right? Just voter registration, these types of things, election administration. So this is one part of the story. We think the Catholic Church in the Philippines, on average, it varies parish to parish, but tends to have a high level of capacity. The other factor that we think of is commitment. So we think this is more of the ideas side of it. Like, do you have the interest in throwing yourself and mobilizing in support of this kind of universalist ends? We think of this as universalist values of kind of like human rights, things like that, as opposed to like, you might call up a local government official, but you may be interested in some parochial interest, right? Like you might want better benefits for your members, or you might want kind of, police officers to come and help you kind of manage traffic at your church on your kind of feast day or something like that. We would say that's not what this is about. This is about if you're willing to use your resources, right, in the public sphere in support of these universalist ends. And if you just want to maybe have a tie to this, it's like, if something is going on, how willing is that actor to actually make the call, to intervene, to call a local politician and yell at them over something that is important to everyone, right? In some cases, not at all. Even in some of our Catholic parishes, priests were less reluctant, or more reluctant to actually do this. Interestingly, if we want to kind of tell the twin story here, where it comes from, why are some priests more interested in doing this? The thing that we kind of trace it back to is the priest's formation. This is effectively like the program of training that Catholic priests go to. One of the things that we identify is it seems that, again, it's not for everyone, but on average, priests who have experience in kind of liberation theology, or we would call it like social action, right? Those tend to be ones that are more interested in leveraging themselves publicly. You guys know kind of liberation theology, kind of a school of Catholic theology that looks at kind of the embedded role of the church, particularly among the poor, kind of strong in Latin America, but also in other areas around the world. And it's kind of more like a mobilizational way of thinking about the church, as opposed to strictly kind of a ceremonial or a theological role. The church is kind of much more engaged. And so we find that priests who have exposure to this tend to be the ones who have higher levels of this.
Preferential option for the poor.
Yes, exactly. But it's, we often hear like the church is a church of the poor, for example. Okay, so this kind of begs a question, and our book is primarily about the Catholic Church. But if we think that the Catholic Church has higher levels of capacity and higher levels of commitment, that allows them to effectively intervene, it's useful for us to ask, like, what does it look like when those things vary, when capacity is lower or commitment is lower? And here we do some brief vignettes looking at other kind of prominent denominations in the Philippines. And obviously, like, we're making kind of sweeping statements. These are, particularly down here, these are kind of more internally diverse religions. They have different views. But one of the things that we kind of tend to see was with this religious group, the INC, we would characterize them as high capacity. Like, they have ties to the government. And if you're familiar in the Philippine context, one way they do this, and they're notorious for it, is this idea of block voting. So they have an instruction, this is who you vote for, and all people in the church are kind of united in doing that. And you can imagine if you're a politician, those are people that are going to get your attention, right? So they have that capacity. They can call people up and get them on the phone. We find that their commitment, though, is lower, right? How we kind of describe it is they are focused not on these universalist ends, but rather on kind of protection for their in-group, right? Protection for members of the organization. And you can kind of see this in how they talk, and maybe in their magazine, for example, which is it's really cool. It's like held here at UW-Madison. It's one of the few places in the world that have runs of this magazine. It's over in the library. You can just kind of see how they talk about, like, the role of the group is to obey, and if you don't obey, then you're kind of disobeying the leader and you're disobeying God. And what it tends to see is, like, people in the group are protected. But if you're not in the group, right, it's kind of like you kind of get, not what you deserve, but it's kind of you're just on the outs. Evangelicals, right? We kind of see a different blend here than Catholics too, and I'm speaking here about like megachurch. So this is like Jesus is Lord, if you're familiar with that group. And again, this is internally diverse, but we also see that evangelicals, particularly under Duterte, do have some high capacity. Like they're evangelicals that are in the administration, have ties to the administration, support it. Because they have a particular view of kind of redemption and sin and punishment, their stance on the drug war tends to be, and again, you can kind of see this in some of their materials and some of the ways that they talk about it, punishment for the wicked, right? You're being punished for things that you've done, right? You may kind of be sorry for your sins, but you still need to be punished for them. And then the mainline Protestants are really interesting. So this is the National Council of Churches of the Philippines. So they have this high commitment, right? Anyone who's familiar with kind of human rights work has kind of bumped into the Protestant networks, right? They're very adept at speaking the language of global human rights. They don't have some of the baggage, frankly, that the Catholics do, right, when speaking kind of in these terms. And so they're very much plugged in international networks, right? So international and secular networks. But we actually find that on the ground, they're very, very weak. Like they don't really have this ability to kind of get these local government officials to do things. So again, these are just kind of quick vignettes to help us flesh out how these things work in practice. But I think it is kind of illustrative in the way that it helps us think through how unique our theory actually is. So I'll go through these kind of just really quickly, but you can imagine them as this is downstream from the commitment and capacity angle. right? So you have those two things maybe in the Catholic Church, they're both high. Then what's next in the stage? This is where we see like 6 mechanisms going out that allows the church to get between the state and the community. One of them, reintegrating victims. One of them, reducing targets. One, disrupting operations. One, threatening accountability. One, building solidarity. One, raising moral salience. And these kind of combine to reduce violence. Now, these red ones are ones that for the rest of the talk, I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time kind of documenting, right? I want to talk through like how we envision them, how we kind of took the evidence that we have, various types, and tried to assess that they actually were happening and they had an effect, producing that plot that we saw earlier of kind of lower violence in areas where there is the Catholic Church. Just to give you like a little brief sense, right? Reintegrating victims would be something like there's a family whose breadwinner has been killed in the drug war. And the standard trajectory for that family is to be completely ostracized locally, right? Neighbors will ignore them, they lose their breadwinner, so they have no source of financial support, right? They're being shunned, right? The children, don't have, have all sorts of trauma that they're dealing with, so on and so forth. And so we imagine, we know actually, the church is stepping in and doing things to try and signal to the broader community that these people are still part of our community and we have to do things for them. So taking them and sitting them at the front seat during Mass, right? Or providing financial aid to widows and orphans, like these types of things. Reducing targets, I'll talk about in kind of just a second. Disrupting operations would essentially be the types of things that make it difficult for local agents of violence to carry out that violence. So watching them. Maybe an analogous case in maybe the US would be something like a ride-along, right? Where like you might go out or a priest might ride along with police officers and you expect that the police officers understand that they have to be professional on their best behavior. Could also be things like hiding people who are at risk of being targeted, like that list of people that Duterte was holding up at the beginning of the presentation. Threatening accountability, I'll talk about. Building solidarity, right? That's just kind of a thing that we know from the study of political violence, that we have these grand narratives, right? Like maybe it's an ideological conflict or religious conflict, but when you actually start drilling into the stories of specific victims, one of the things that seems to matter is that there's just been some personality conflict, right? Like these two people were feuding over a property line, or like their families were competitors in business, and they took the opportunity of this big ideological conflict between left and right or whatever to kind of settle that score. And so what we imagine the church doing in these situations is basically providing venues for like dispute resolution so that these conflicts don't escalate to the point where somebody thinks that they can settle the score by using the police. So I'll talk about these 3 in depth, but if anybody is interested in the others, right, I'm happy to talk about them. Okay, so I'm just gonna walk you through the data that we used to answer these questions. You guys have already seen this, right? This is those chloropleth maps that I put up of the killings. We were also very fortunate to work with a diocese that has to remain nameless for security reasons, basically, to survey dozens of parishes. And so these were extensive surveys that went out to priests and laity who worked at these parishes, and it asked them probably 100 questions about what their parishes were doing during the drug war, what they were not doing, what were their thoughts on drugs and priests and so on and so forth. And ordinarily, like if you put a 100-question survey in front of someone, they would tell you to get lost. However, if the bishop tells you you're doing this, you're gonna get those 100 questions back. So we're very, very fortunate to get this. We had a question, frankly, and this is like just like a moral and ethical thing for us. When we thought about this project, we had to think about like, what, did we have any red lines? Like, were there any things that we weren't willing to do that we thought would be problematic? And we had basically two. One is we said, we are not going to interview victims' families, right? That's just, we don't have it's not worth it, re-traumatize them, all of these types of things. We're not gonna do that. The other thing that we decided that we're not gonna do is, we're not gonna engage directly with the police, right? Be a natural thing that you might do, you want their perspective. We just felt that the nature of the project and the phenomenon that we were studying, it wasn't for us. We still had a question of how we get the police's opinions. What we decided to do, I don't know, does anybody here even use Facebook anymore, right? Like, yeah, okay, some of us older people do, absolutely, I do. If you know on Facebook, you'll see like you have every now and then ads that get pushed into your feed. And those ads are not random, right? Those ads are generated based on the things that you like, right? So if you like, I love the Chicago Bulls basketball team. And so Facebook knows that, and it sells that information to advertisers, and you'll get ads in your feed for Chicago Bulls gear or something like that, or basketball shoes or whatever. So what we did was we used that algorithm to put ads, to take an online survey in the Facebook feeds of people we plausibly thought were members of the Philippines National Police. So people liked certain pages or had their interests or marked as their occupation as being something we thought would be connected to the Philippines National Police. They were more likely to see an ad to take our survey. And then once they got into our survey, we had a number of ways that we kind of filtered out, you know, the people who weren't police or maybe were like a mall security guard or something like that. And so at the end of the day, we ended up culling the vast majority of our responses we just threw out. But then we were left with responses that we say are plausibly police officers. And we can survey them and we can kind of ask them certain things. We also worked with a prominent Filipino public opinion outfit, the Social Weather Station, to do nationwide surveys, and we had some experiments that we put in there to chase down some effects. We did a big tranche of in-person interviews. Some of this was following up on interviews here that we thought were super interesting. Others were just new interviews. And then I also want to just basically flag here, for anyone who knows the Philippines, like the investigative work that Filipino journalists, but also particularly Rappler has been doing is just astonishing. Like the type of work that they produce under extremely difficult circumstances has been vital to this project, and frankly, it would probably be so much worse, if not completely implausible, if we did not have that backbone of material to rely upon. And then we also were able to kind of look at print material by other bodies. The Philippines National Police, for example, they have a magazine, a quarterly magazine that we can use to again kind of buttress our understanding of how they viewed this conflict. Okay. So the drug war, just to give you a sense of the policy of how it's executed. Intelligence is collected, including tips, very problematically, from just local people, right? And you could text in, you could drop a tip in a box anonymously, right? The police kind of have that information, they kind of coordinate a response, they visit the house of the person, and they effectively, or at least are supposed to, kind of knock on the door and tell them, like, we know you are involved with drugs, you have a choice of either going to rehab or going to prison. And in point, this is where a lot of the violence happens. So if you read the reports of deaths in the drug war, it tends to be, at least according to the official narrative, police show up, attempt to do this, suspect pulls a gun, attempts to fight back, and then they're killed by the police, like often under, I would just say, implausible circumstances. So just as, in order to kind of set your mind of how this works. So these are just quotes from our fieldwork that get us to this first dynamic. This is one of the red terms on that prior slide. How do the churches threaten accountability? And so the idea here is something like police officers, these local bureaucrats, right? You have the populace telling them, go out and do this, right? Carry out these actions in the local community. The police officer is thinking, okay, I have to kind of follow the rules, but I'm also worried that at some point I'm going to be held accountable for this, right? I might lose my job, I might get outed in the paper, I might be hauled into court, whatever. So they're trying to balance these two things. And what we think, or what we have an intuition is going on, is what the church is able to do at the local level is bump up that likelihood that they will be held accountable, right? And at some level, it's going to tip the scale, where that local officer has a choice: use violence and potentially run the consequences, or find some other way, right, to handle the situation. Like, these just kind of, I'll let you guys read them, I'm not going to read them, but this gives you a sense of the idea of what people on the ground were kind of telling us. And you kind of see it across the spectrum a little bit, right? You see human rights investigators, secular human rights investigators, kind of telling us we have to rely on the police to even get this information. Journalists, we can't talk to the families, but if the priest is there and gives us an introduction, they'll open up and talk to us. And then basically people saying, look, like, we're on the ground. We know we were doing this and it had an effect, okay? Now, one of the questions is how we can show this. I want to kind of flag this, right? This is kind of interesting. One of our parishes was handing out these flyers. These were like little paper flyers to ordinary people, and they were also instructing them to give them to the police. And their titling, I mean, you can see the 10 warnings, 10 commandments, so on and so forth. But what they were trying to do is basically show people that they have rights, they can push back on the police, but also communicate to the police that the people have the information to file complaints against them, right? Depending on how effective you think complaints against the police might be, right? But you can kind of see this process through these little pamphlets. This is translated. The thing that was not shown here is on the pamphlet, there's also a little a phrase at the bottom that says, failure to follow the law has consequences, including the loss of your job, right? So it's flagging to the police that, like, there may be consequences for this. How do we know if this has an effect, right? This is very speculative, but one of the things that we did is we went back to our Facebook sample and we ran an experiment. And for those of you who are not kind of versed in experiments, one of the things that we basically do is you divide people into a treatment and control group, which you are familiar with, maybe from like a vaccine trial, for example. And then you make one small intervention into that treatment group. So we took our police officers and we randomly sorted them into two groups, right? They're the same on average across both of these groups. No real difference in them. One group read this heading with the red text. The other group read this without the red text. So what we're trying to do for the group that reads this with the red text, we're trying to put in their mind that the Catholic Church is watching, effectively. Like, that's what we want them to be thinking. And then afterwards, we ask them some questions. And we can see statistically if the groups differ. The one I want you to focus on is this one. How much do you agree with the principle that critics' pressure can cause career problems? Remember, we're asking police officers this. And what we find is that those who read the red text, this is our treatment group, their average response is a stronger level of agreement than the people who didn't read that red text. We interpret this as basically, if you tell people the church is watching, you are more likely to think that there are career problems if critics go after you, okay? There's some other evidence in the book that maybe suggests that this is right, but we kind of find that this is one indication that's consistent with that. Another mechanism, reducing targets. So effectively, the police are ostensibly going out, targeting drug users. So if you can do things to reduce the number of drug users, you might actually reduce violence. Pretty clear example, this is a simple thing of providing drug rehabilitation programs. It's also like a interesting kind of counterpoint. If you think about that last mechanism as being a very confrontational approach to the police, right? We are watching you and we will punish you if you do something wrong. This one is even more about collaboration. We'll work with the police, right? We'll help you do your job. The president is telling you to end the drug problem. We're going to help you do that, except we're not going to make you kill. So we have some like narratives that support this, right? Like this predictably, when the drug war starts, it overwhelms the capacity of public and private providers in the Philippines to deal with it, right? People basically en masse go to surrender and go into drug rehabilitation. There's no capacity to receive them. So the church really kind of mobilizes. And there's this moment that like they understand the clock is ticking, right? People that they can't rehabilitate are at a higher likelihood of being killed. Now, this is a tricky one because we did find that for some cases, church rehabilitation programs are a place where some church workers might take this as an opportunity to evangelize, right? To try and spread the religion rather than impart religious and moral lessons. But the priests, at least many of our priests that we talk to, like this is a priest who is in charge of the entire kind of drug rehabilitation program, just basically said, you know, one of our tasks is like we have to educate the counselors as well, right? You can't go in and moralize with these people. So you see a sense from both kind of the police, right, and some of the people who work in the rehab side, that if somebody is in a rehabilitation program, that maybe not totally removes them from the target pool, but it lessens the likelihood that they will be targeted. Okay. And this is just a way that the church kind of had built this, right? It's very interesting. There were these UN drug rehabilitation protocols that predated the drug war, but only by a few weeks, that basically like the people who were forced to learn about drug rehabilitation and stand up these programs, they had to quickly figure out how to do it. They had the capacity in many cases, they had the space and the volunteers and so on and so forth. They didn't know anything about the theory or the practice of drug rehabilitation. And so they stood up this program based on kind of UN recommendations, nested it inside the community, and you do see some effects that this prevented at least some people from violent consequences. Now the last one I'll talk about is kind of a difficult one, right? If you remember at the outset, one of the things that we think is unique about this form of violence is that the populist is waging this campaign of dehumanization. And this has like knock-on effects all down through the way that the drug war was carried out, right? It's in terms of how police officers think about suspects or drug users. It's how the community reacts to the killing of somebody in their community, all these types of things, right? There's all of these ways that this is a kind of a real problem for the community. And so what we see is that there are moments where priests and kind of religious symbology, religious figures mobilize their own kind of moral language to contest this, right? You have the populace saying these people are not human, they don't, they deserve neither due process nor respect. Then you have religious figures weighing in and saying, no, actually, it's part of your obligation as a human or as a Catholic or as a religious person, whatever, to care for these people, or at least care what happens about them. I think the one thing that I would flag here is we thought that this is an area where the priests would have a major comparative advantage. Like, we expected that if a priest kind of comes out and kind of preaches to their parishioners, that the parishioners would listen to this. We got very mixed responses on this count. There were some priests that basically said, no, I actually don't even do this. Like, I think this is not something that we should talk about from the pulpit. This is government stuff. This is state. We're church. So that's like a little scrambling of that commitment idea at the front end of the presentation. There were other priests who said, yeah, like, I tried. I stood up there and I told people about this, but they just shut off, right? Or nobody would come and engage with me, right? Some of you guys are probably in this camp right now for this presentation. I'm just blacking out. But we did find that it was not universally successful. And we kind of did a similar experiment, this time not with our police, but this is just with ordinary Filipinos, right? So this is us working with Social Weather Station. It's the exact same logic of like a treatment and a control group. One group reads the red text, the other group reads the exact same without the red text. And we thought, like, let's see if we can get that same mention of a priest to shift your attitudes on the drug war. And we basically find, you know, it is a very, very weak effect. It is positive. It's kind of on the very borderline of we can't really tell if this is an actual effect or if this is just random noise in the data. We had people choose, do you think it's more likely that the drug war protects communities or does it violate human rights? Put yourself on the spectrum. You know, if people got the priest, they bumped up a little bit more towards violates human rights, but again, we're not necessarily sure that this is something other than just statistical noise. So this one is, I think, a weaker one. Okay, so if I could just close up here. This was a massively violent campaign against effectively unarmed society. This is not, you know, we have some kind of additional work in the book where we try and analogize this to other situations around the world. And one that we look at in some detail is in Brazil, right? Where police, under a populist, Bolsonaro, kind of target ordinary citizens under the guise of a war on drugs. Like, Brazil is kind of a weird case because those are not necessarily the same as the kind of ordinary Filipinos who are maybe recreational users of drugs that allow them to basically work long shifts. In Brazil, there's much more heavily armed drug gangs who are involved in the conflict. But these is kind of ordinary people, no defenses, many times the most helpless people in society that are being killed en masse. And we find that some of the impact seems to be mitigated by the Catholic Church. We find that there are these kind of two overarching factors that open up basically 6 pathways through which this effect plausibly comes. Okay? And I want to close by, and this is something that we struggled with actually. We had people, including kind of priests and human rights workers and activists, basically telling us that, like, you want to write a story about the Catholic Church protecting communities in the drug war. But what you're telling me is there were tens of thousands, kind of massive death toll of Filipinos. Like, how can you talk about protection in this environment? Like, this incredible loss of life. And I think that the way to think about it is not that, like, the Catholic Church failed, but if you ask yourself, and here I'm going to reveal myself as a politician or a political scientist, like, ask yourself the counterfactual question. What would the drug war have looked like if the Catholic Church did not exist? Like, that is how you will find what success looks like. We actually asked this question. and this is a human rights activist, it has to remain unnamed, but when we asked him, what would the drug war have been like if the Catholic Church did not exist? This is what he told us. So not universally successful, not able to protect every person, every community at every time and place, but it did save lives. Okay, so thank you all very much for your attention. I have my email address on the first slide, but you can find me in North Hall. I'd be happy to chat with any of you about this if it's interesting, but I really appreciate the opportunity again. Thanks.